All right. Well, thank you everyone for your patience. We have a very exciting program today. My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm a professor of political science here and director of the Center for European Studies. And welcome to everyone to this month's Conversation on Europe, which is in collaboration with the German Department's Campus Weeks program. For today's Conversation on Europe, we will be discussing Germany since 1989, and if differences still persist after reunification. As you all know, since we sent half of you away, we are live streaming this in our global hub in Posvar Hall, which is a first for us, which is very exciting. And just to give you a heads up, this is a monthly series for those of you that are not familiar with it. And our next conversation will be on November 12th, and it will be on migration in the Mediterranean. And we will be returning to our usual location in USIS and at 12 noon for time. And this is all on our website. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center and the University Center of International Studies. And we have a long list of co-sponsors for this event today, and I will run through them. First, the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, Wunderbar Together, which is an initiative of the German Foreign Office, the Goethe Institute, and the Federation of German Industries. Joining us virtually are several of our co-sponsors, which are the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech. Thank you to my colleagues in the European Studies Center for helping with today's organization, as well as Jacqueline Karash in the German department for bringing us all together. So to get us started, a little bit of background, which we are probably very familiar with. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And less than 1 year later, on October 3rd, which we've just passed, 1990, the country that had been divided since World War II was reunified. Reunification joined together 16 million East Germans in the 5 states of the former GDR, the German Democratic Republic, with 63 million West Germans in the 10 states of the former Federal Republic of Germany, and created the 16th state of Berlin. The capital of unified Germany was Berlin, and the parliament and the government moved from Bonn in 1999. While the country was officially unified in 1990, social, economic, and political differences have persisted. Today's discussion will discuss not only what these differences are, but why we have these differences, why they still persist, and what the effects and implications of these differences are, and if these differences will continue. So we have a lot of ground to cover. To tackle these important questions and help us to understand the current state of German politics and society today, I am joined by a panel of experts, which I now have the pleasure to introduce. To my immediate left is David Gill, who is the Consul General at the German Consulate General in New York. He grew up in a Protestant minister's family in Herrnhut, Saxony, in former East Germany. He was denied a higher education by the communist regime for political reasons. Instead, he trained and worked as a plumber before joining a preparatory Protestant school and later the Theological Seminary of the Protestant Church in Berlin-Brandenburg. In 1990, he initially was the chair of the Normannenstrasse Citizens Committee, which oversaw the dissolution of the Ministry of State Security at the Stasi headquarters, and served as the secretary of the Special Committee for the Dissolution of the Stasi of the East German Parliament. After reunification, Mr. Gill became spokesman and head of the research division of the Federal Commissioner for the Stasi files before studying law in Berlin and in Philadelphia. After holding positions in the Federal Ministry of the Interior and at the Commissioner for Data Protection and Freedom of Information in Berlin, Mr. Gill served as the deputy representative of the Council of the Protestant Church in Germany to the Federal Republic of Germany and the European Union. During Federal President Joachim Gauck's term from 2012 to 2017, he was the State Secretary and Chief of Staff of the President. Since 2017, Mr. Gill has been the German Consul General in New York. You're welcome.
Thank you.
To my further left is Jan Musekamp, who is a DAD Associate Professor in the Department of History here at Germany. From 2007 to 2018, Dr. Musekamp taught history at the European University Viadrina at Frankfurt-Oder in former East Germany. Previously, he held a postdoctoral fellowship at Washington University in St. Louis and served as visiting assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a cultural historian of Germany and Eastern Europe, specializing in the 19th and 20th centuries. His publications include From Stettin to Schützen, Metamorphoses of a City, 1945 to 2005, and a co-edited book, Migration and Mobility in the Modern Age, Refugees, Travelers, and Traffickers in Europe and Eurasia, published by Indiana University Press. He's currently working on a second book manuscript, From Paris to St. Petersburg and From Kovno to New York, a cultural history of transnational mobility in East Central Europe, in which he examines the role that infrastructure plays in the development of social networks and economic systems with a special focus on East Central Europe. Joining us on one of the screens is Jonathan Olsen, who is a professor of political science and the chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Texas Women's University. Previously, he was a professor of politics, philosophy, and law at the University of Wisconsin, Parkside. His research has primarily focused on German and European political parties, specifically parties of the radical right and the radical left. He's the author of numerous scholarly articles that have appeared in journals such as German Politics and Society, and Problems of Post-Communism. He's the author of 4 books. The most recent is a co-authored textbook, The European Union, Politics and Policies. In addition, he is a 3-time Fulbright Scholar, including from 1988 to 1990, when he was in Germany during the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a German Academic Exchange Service DAAD Fellow. He also serves on the executive board of the Alumni Association of the German Academic Exchange Service, and has appeared as a commentator on German TV and radio in newspapers as well. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
For joining us, Julie. And we will have another expert who will be joining us shortly, so I will hold off on introducing her until she appears on the screen. All right, so we have lots to talk about today. So I thought we would start with some basics from our panelists, and just to give us a sense of what are perhaps some of the demographic differences between the East and West. So perhaps, Mr. Gill, if you'd like to start us giving us kind of a sense of the landscape.
I mean, I'm not a demographic expert,
Yes,
but of course, the East, if you see it as total, is this much smaller part of Germany. And what happened over the last 30 years, particularly in the 90s, a big part of a generation left this region. Mm-hmm. I always tell the story, when I left school in '82, my classmates went on, they learned to trade in the coal mine, in the power plant, in car manufacturing, or textile industry. So when it was the communist economic space, so there was no competition with the West. And when the wall fell and the reunification came, all the jobs were gone. Mm-hmm. Coal mine is a big lake, the power plant is gone, cars were not manufactured for 30 years in this region, and textile industry was gone in a heartbeat. So that shaped the landscape, the villages and the towns and the cities in this region. The more east you go, the more profound this change is. So the demographics are very different. Saxony was, before the war, very vibrant industrial region. It's no longer, and it was not able to recover the war and 40 years of communist economic system. Mm-hmm. So we won't be at the same state again where Saxony was in comparison with Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, etc. Mm-hmm. So this is a fact, and we have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. There are different regions in the north of West Germany as well, which are not developed industrially like the south, and we have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But that's maybe the most profound difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you want to jump in and give us a sense of some of these differences?
Yeah, I mean, I could just add to what you just said. So I moved from West Germany to East Germany for college, right? From the extreme west to the extreme east. And where? Frankfurt. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's really the extreme east, right? Is, yeah. Easternmost city of, Görlitz is probably a little bit farther east.
It's my own.
Okay, so we're on the same page. Yeah. And yeah, Görlitz is another example, but I know Frankfurt, and between the mid-1990s and 2012, I think, when it stopped, the city lost 30% of its inhabitants, right? So it was a city of 88,000 or 89,000, and nowadays, and I looked it up yesterday, we are at 58,000. Yeah? So it's a huge loss, and when we are going to for example, to the opera or the theater, we see that there's this generation that you mentioned that's missing, right? It's the generation that graduated around the year 90 or was in a job around the year 90, and they moved to the West when they were young enough to do so. So what we see in theaters is young people, very young people, or very old people. And then there's a couple of 40s in between. Right? So you can really see this huge difference today. Yeah? So maybe that's just one.
Sure.
And I mean, this means not just people are moving, but it also means that villages especially, the countryside is depopulated. Frankfurt had to demolish part of its housing. We now see that probably it will grow again, so it's probably too fast to demolish. And we have enormous problems with the infrastructure. It was built to serve a city of almost 90,000. So even in the early 90s, they built a sewage treatment plant, which was laid out to serve 100,000 people because the blooming landscapes were about to appear. And now it's serving 50,000. So the capacity is not related to the total, to the number of inhabitants.
So just to sort of follow up on something that both of you mentioned, so we see this major population decline. People are moving to the West. And as well, the economies have had to sort of reinvent themselves, right? You mentioned the coal mines are closed, the steel mills are closed. So what has taken their place?
In the economy?
Yeah, in the economy. So if that's not...
Yeah, of course. We have universities in Frankfurt. Public service was spread in part also in East Germany. And you have the smaller companies in Frankfurt. But there's no major, no DAX company is located in East Germany. The biggest company in East Germany is maybe Jena, with 3,200 employees. That's it. So it's the so-called Mittelstand or even smaller. Mittelstand companies between 20 and 100 employees, service industry, but mostly not. You don't find big companies at this point.
Yeah, the biggest company for a while was the Arbeitsamt. How is that in English? I mean,
Labor.
No.
The agency that's taking care of the unemployed,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, in Frankfurt, which I consider my hometown now, the unemployment rate was at 20%, and this is already after 30% of the population left the city. So this gives an idea of the scale that the industry and production was cut down. Maybe, in the case of Frankfurt, more than 50%. So I mean, Pittsburgh also has a history of industrial decline, but I think the scale is even bigger in East Germany.
Jonathan, do you want to join in the conversation and other observations that you have about sort of the demographic changes that we've been talking about in comparison East versus West as well?
Yeah, probably not much more to add to what's already been said, except to note that, you know, even though we're looking at East-West differences, it is interesting to see the differences within the states and also just between rural and urban areas, because it always strikes me that the major urban centers are all pretty, you know, shiny and new. And when you go out to the smaller towns and so forth, then you can notice still some real differences.
Yeah.
But this is part of the economy too. There's a lot of construction was going on over the last 30 years. If you even go to the smaller villages, as long as people live there, they look so different from 30 years ago. And there was put so much money also in the infrastructure, I have to say. I come from a village of 2,000 people, and it looks totally different. Renovated, every building is renovated, and new buildings are built. And people are, however, still not satisfied, or some at least. And then I always tell them, go 10 kilometers or 10 miles east. There's a Polish border. Now you can cross it easily. It was not possible 30 years ago. And that looks still very different, or very much like, not the same, like 1990, but you see that there's not so much construction going on. There was not the money we were supposed to do. And so it looks very different. East Germany, East Berlin, cities, villages were gray and gray. If you have visited East Germany before the wall came down, it looked very different from today.
So is some of this new building that's been going on, is the investment coming from, where is the investment coming from? Is the investment coming from West German companies? Is it coming from folks that had been living in the West, moving east, whether for university or for other things? And so where is sort of some of this investment, both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of population? Where is that coming
A
from?
lot of public money. And there were big programs in landmark conservation, big monies. And private investments, a lot of West German companies invested in East Germany, also international. And by now there are also entrepreneurs from the East who made some money and can invest.
Yeah, and at least in my hometown, there was also substantial investment from the United States. And so there were a couple of companies coming over. Some of them closed down later on, but I think foreign investment was also important.
So I think, for most, Americans, there still is this, and whether it's a perception of difference or if it's a real sort of difference, right? Between sort of the former East, the former West. What would you say to someone that said, oh, there's still these major differences, whether it's in terms of economy, whether it's in terms of demographics, is there still this difference that is perhaps the perception, or is there, from your own experiences?
I mean, I can start. So for me, I'd rather mention the good things that makes also the difference, right? So one of the reasons why we did not move to the West with my family was that having kids, it's fairly easy to find, for example, daycare, right? That's a legacy of the GDR. So when the big discussion about daycare came up in West or in Germany as a whole about 15 years ago, West Germany had to build it up from scratch basically. And in East Germany, the system was in place and it survived the collapse of communism. And so it was fairly easy for us, for example, to find daycare from an early age without waiting, as in West Germany. So that's I think a major difference, which is very positive, right? Yeah, I mean, the negative differences, there's a lot to say about that, especially in economy. I'm not an economist, but you can see it from those who graduated with me from high school. So, and most of them stayed, of course, in West Germany. And also most of them, their career was easier, right? They stayed there, and also wages usually are higher, even today, in West Germany. Than they are in East Germany. So I think there's still a difference in income that's about 20% when it comes to wages, right? And then it's
Not
either
that high.
not high.
Anymore. But there is still
A difference, right? And that's the people who have a job, right? So there's a lot of people who still today do not have a job or do not have an adequate job. So speaking of our university, and that's also something that's worth noting. All the better paid jobs, most of the better paid jobs, with the exception of maybe 2 or 5%, are held by West Germans today, which is really striking. And I mean, you are really an exception when it comes to the Foreign Office, where I also used to work for 1.5 years. There is hardly any people from the East who are in the public service in the higher positions, and also in companies. So in my home university, all but I think 5 professors were imports from the West, and also their students who would take their place later on are also from the West. So these networks are very, very strong. So that's probably a difference So it's almost like an alien spaceship that landed somewhere in East Germany, right? With all the lower paid jobs taken by East Germans and the professorships taken by West Germans. And I'm saying that I'm a West German originally, but I'm striking.
Yeah.
I want to add something and explain something why it is like this. I don't want to defend it and not defend it 30 years after the wall came down, but there was a reason, of course, that after the wall came down and after reunification, we looked very carefully who is teaching in East German universities. As you heard, I wasn't even allowed to go to high school for political reasons. The whole educational system was a truly ideologized institution. And my father was a Protestant minister. I didn't join the communist youth movement, so it was very clear: no high school, no university. And to become a professor, particularly professor of a law professor or history was a subject of high ideology. What he taught us about the Third Reich was the communists were the righteous people. They came to concentration camps, and Thälmann was Ernst Thälmann. He was the leader of the Communist Party in Nazi Germany. He was killed, and we all know what the Communist Party also did in this time, and they were not helpful for the democratization of Germany. However, that was what we were taught about the Third Reich, and yes, there was a Holocaust, this word we didn't know, but yes, the Jews were killed, but this was more or less a story beside the righteous communist people. Just an example how ideologized the whole issue was. And law, of course, political science, it was not what he expected in a free university system. So that's why we looked very carefully who is teaching the young generation in East Germany or then unified Germany. That's why it was right to move some professors out of the universities. But in doing this, I think they went overboard. The East Germans in general hadn't learned in their society to fight for their own rights and to compete. And it was easier than to find professors from West Germany with an impressive CV who had studied in Oxford or even somewhere abroad, and that is the origins. In the end, who's from the West and who's from the East? The new generation where the parents came from the West are now, this is now this generation from the East. So that's this part. Yeah, this also explains that in the public service, not many East Germans had a chance to get career. After the wall and it fell, and then later on as well. And you know, I'm one of very few heads of foreign missions of German foreign service who grew up in East Germany. It will change with the generations, and that's why I'm more relaxed than sometimes. Every year when the celebration of now 30 years of the fall of the wall comes, we have the discussion in the media, were the East Germans treated rightly? Why are there still so many differences? And did the unification work, or didn't it work? Should we have had more time? I would say, after all, with all the problems, it went pretty bad. We are a unified country. 76% of the East Germans and 78% of the West Germans say at their personal situation, that they are satisfied with their personal situation. I would say that's a pretty high number. 2/3 of the East Germans also say that they still feel not equal with the West Germans. That's interesting to compare these numbers. But in general, the younger the people were when the wall came down, or when they were born after. I mean, who are 30 now, they were born in the unified Germany. The less the difference between East and West there are more differences sometimes between the South and the North. And I'm very convinced that this will be with the next generations. We won't have this discussion anymore.
Well, thank you, and there's so much to sort of unpack with everything that you've said. And I want to get back to questions about identity in a bit, but I also want to take a moment to introduce our fourth panelist that has joined us. Hope, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, yes.
Good.
Welcome. So a brief introduction of her. So Hope M. Harrison is an associate professor of history and international affairs at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. She's a historian of modern Europe and of the Cold War. She's the author of Driving the Soviets Up the Wall and the expanded and updated version of the book in German, Ulbricht's Mauer, which was published in 2011. Her most recent book, and very relevant to today's conversation, is After the Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the Present, which was just published by Cambridge. In addition, she's published a variety of articles on the Cold War, Germany, and Russia. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Council on Germany, and the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. In Germany, she's a member of the Atlantic Gruppe and the Berlin Wall Memorial Association, and serves on the boards of the Allied Museum, the Cold War Center, and the Foundation for German-American Academic Relations. She's appeared as an expert on Cold War history, Russia, and Germany on TV in the US and abroad. So welcome.
Thank you.
And I think since we've been talking a bit about, of course, the anniversary and the fall of the wall itself, thought maybe we'd take a break from some of the discussion we've been having and talk a bit about sort of the wall itself and the fall of the wall and how it's remembered differently in the East and the West. Hope, if you'd like to offer your thoughts on that.
Yes, yes. Well, it's very exciting to join you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Of course, the fall of the wall is a much more emotional, impactful moment for people in the East than people in the West. For people in the East, it's so much of their lives, whereas people in the West, particularly if they didn't have any family in the East, you know, for many people in the West, it hasn't changed their lives. And in fact, people in the West are a bit more critical of the effects of the wall and unification than people in the East are, actually. What I have found very interesting is the way the German leaders have treated the narrative about what happened in 1989. And the focus of that very much the focus of the official, most common view of the fall of the wall is on the East Germans, the role of the East Germans who took to the streets in what's called the Peaceful Revolution of 1989 and brought down that wall. And there are many people in the East who have been rather frustrated that the fall of the wall gets sort of lumped together with unification. Unification took place less than a year after the fall of the wall, but was a separate thing. And of course, not all of the East Germans who took to the streets in 1989, in fact, wanted unification or wanted it the way it happened, by being fused into West Germany, instead of starting anew with sort of a parliamentary assembly, a constitutional assembly, and deciding, okay, what should our new country look like? What kind of a constitution should we have? Instead, the West German system just expanded to East Germany. So that's something that I've noticed very much. The tendency in Germany is to conflate these two different processes. The one process of the East Germans demanding change, including the freedom to travel and not to be shot if you tried to go across the border without permission. That process of East Germany for those kinds of changes was different, although also contributed to the process that led to German unification.
Great, thank you. I've noticed everyone taking notes, so I imagine everyone wants to contribute to this. Jonathan, do you want to offer any comments on this? You were not taking notes.
Comments to offer on this particular one, so I'll leave it to my other panel.
Okay, sorry. And please do let me know if you want to jump in,
Sure.
so I can, but yeah.
I just want to, not correct, but add maybe to what Hope said. Yes, there were discussions in East Germany to find a so-called third way between capitalism in West Germany and communism or real existing socialism in East Germany. But in the end, it was a discussion of elite is maybe the wrong word, but a group who really wanted to find a better way for society. People who were very crucial for the peaceful revolution, who worked in the churches, in opposition, etc., and who didn't think that it is a good idea to quickly combine both Germanies and let's try something new. Not everything what works in West Germany is the best way, maybe. So there was a discussion in a way of the elites. The Neue Forum, the new group of opposition, other oppositional groups. But who won the election, the first and only free election in East Germany on March 18th in 1990? We had one free election in 40 years. It was a so-called Alliance for Germany. And in this alliance, there were three parties. One party was the CDU, Christian Democratic Union in East Germany. We had a Christian Democratic Union in East Germany. It was just a satellite party for the Communist Party to make believe democracy. However, people used this party to run for the election. People who were more conservative and people who were, and this party was picked by Kohl's CDU in West Germany as partner party, not the new parties, the Social Democrats or the movements, no, the CDU. And two smaller groups, Demokratischer Aufbruch, the DSU, Democratic Social Union, they formed this Alliance for Europe. They were not, or maybe not the majority of these politicians were the people who were front runners in peaceful revolution. But they made the election because people relied on them, that they bring them together with West Germany as soon as possible. That was a very clear message of this election. There was a lot of disappointment in these new movements. They were convinced that they would win this election. So there was no real choice. And in retrospect, even majority of the people who thought we should find a better way, a third way, most of them say it was the right way. It was the kairos, the chance of the time to unify these two parts of Germany. But I just wanted to explain what happened.
Did you want
Maybe,
to?
yeah, maybe I can add to this. So it was really a unique opportunity also when we look at it from external policy, right?
That's what I meant.
So I mean, the Western powers, okay, they would probably agree, but just as you look at the Soviet Union, which was dissolved just 1 year after or 2 years after, right? can really not imagine what would have happened if someone like Putin would rule at this time, right? He would probably not have allowed for German unification. So I totally agree. I mean, people had probably other ideas of how their life would change to the better, how quickly, but in retrospect, I would totally agree. 95% of the people would say, yeah, that was the right thing to do at this time.
May I just add something quickly?
Sure. Yeah.
I'll just echo what the other speakers have said, and I think it's interesting when I, teaching students, they often think of the fall of the wall, then immediately, then followed by unification. So the fall of the wall means unification. And that's probably how, it's not just students, a lot of Americans think about it. But, living in Germany at that time, I just remember how open everything was between November 9th and then unification, and of course, already mentioned about the German elections. What an open question it was. What was going to happen? It was not fated that Germany would be unified. Perhaps it was inexorably leading that way because of lots of other factors, but living in that moment, it did not feel fated in any sense that unification would quickly follow. It felt like a very big open question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant, which you said so nicely. Yeah, I meant that exactly. So many Americans don't realize, and others who weren't in Germany at the time, conflate these two processes, and that it's so important to speaking as a historian, to really think back to what the situation was in November of 1989 when the wall opened, and that it was so open and there was so much going on. And yes, certainly unification was one option, but that was by no means the only or the guaranteed option. And I just think it's important to recognize what a moment that was. I mean, it was the unknown. It was exciting. It was scary for many people. I myself, the night of November 9th, was in fact on a plane headed to West Berlin. I took off from city on the evening of November 9th when nothing had happened. And when I touched down in Frankfurt the next morning and then got on the commuter plane to West Berlin, everyone was reading the newspaper with this big headline, Die Mauer ist offen, the wall is open. And I thought to myself, is my German not that good? What's going on? And I didn't have to wonder for long, because the pilot got on the microphone and said, ladies and gentlemen, in case you haven't heard, the Berlin Wall fell last night and we are flying into history. So I spent 9 amazing days in Berlin, having meetings in West Berlin, but also going to some of the demonstrations in East Berlin of people that were so excited and said, okay, the wall is open, now we want free elections, and we want change, and we want the old leaders to step down, and we want the end to the Stasi. And it was really amazing to experience that.
That's a great memory and a great experience to share with everyone. I wonder, Hope, if you could talk a bit too, and then everyone else can, of course, jump in as well, about how young Germans, that were not alive, that were born post-89, which now is obviously a whole generation of individuals as old as almost 30, or including 30, how they remember, what their experience was with growing up sort of post-wall, and sort of remember, and this idea of remembering and memory of the wall that, obviously formed so much of who they would become, perhaps, and also of their parents' generation, but not something that they experienced themselves. And so I wonder if you want to jump in and say something about that to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so many young Germans who've been born since the fall of the wall can't fathom it. I mean, that's partly what got me interested in the topic, thinking how on earth could a city be divided? How could this have happened? And so, you know, I've talked to some young people who are starting to talk to their parents and their grandparents and ask them, you know, how could this have happened? And what was your experience? What did you know about it? And I've been fascinated by lots of younger East Germans who have been writing memoirs about their families, and in the process, you know, talking to their family members to find out and, you know, do this research into their own family past. Of course, people born since the fall of the wall, they only know United Germany and freedom of travel and, you know, Europe and the globe being open to them. So for most of them, it's a non-issue. And I think David Gill said this before, that, you know, the generational change, sort of the wall in the mind will be less and less of an issue, but it's still the case, depending upon the circumstances, that kids born since the wall are of course affected by the experience that their parents and grandparents have had. So if they have parents or grandparents who were, you know, out of work because the system in East Germany ended and the factories closed down, or they were teaching Marxism, Leninism, and, you know, that wasn't so necessary anymore. You know, if their parents and grandparents have had a rough time adjusting to the very different system, this of course affects their view of the young people too. And so, you know, you certainly, I've certainly talked to people who feel that way, but I do think over time it will be less of an issue. But they're interested. I mean, and I've talked to a lot of students who, you know, we aren't taught enough about this in school. School, like, you know, often they tell me that history sort of goes through World War II, and there isn't much about the period of divided Germany. And they all say, you know, they want to learn more and need to learn more. And there have been surveys, of course, of kids and what they know and don't know about this history. So I think there's interest and sort of figuring out this crazy world that used to exist with the wall.
Yeah, so maybe just to add on what you just said, when I'm looking at my kids, I see this this change a lot. So my parents, who are really West Germans, right? And they, whenever they visit us in Frankfurt, so they say, we are going back to Germany, right? Meaning we are going back to West Germany, right? It's, they do not kind of, you know, it's not about this is the worst Germany, but they still have this Cold War mindset with there is Germany, and this means kind of West Germany, and Germany ends at, you know, the Elbe River. Yeah? We had relatives in near Leipzig, and we traveled a lot there, but still there was this feeling that this is not part of our world. Today, my kids, I mean, for them it's not a difference, and their cousins who grow up in West Germany, they do not feel this, right? So I'm totally on your side when you say it's a question of the new generation, right? So they do not feel this difference, they do not speak about it too much, but there's also this danger of forgetting the sacrifice, for example, of the people who went to the streets at the time. So the fall of the wall is definitely important, but we should not forget about the demonstrations that happened, for example, in October, when this was kind of a decisive point to see that, okay, we are going to the streets and the state is not intervening the way the state did in China, for example, right? So if you think about 200,000 people that went on the street in Leipzig in October,
Tomorrow it's 30 years ago.
Tomorrow.
yeah, exactly. Just 2 days after the celebration of 40 years of the GDR, which is really unbelievable. And this gives us an impression of also the scope and the fight that people had to have here, right? And it's not just the fall of the wall; it's so much more that's going on before and after. It's a very strong symbol, but I would say it's worth looking to the left and to the right.
Maybe something to add. The generation who didn't grow up in East Germany but still feels East German. That happens. And indeed, it's very different in which families they grow up. Hope said it. It's their parents were part of the system and they lost their career, their job, their importance or their power. Of course, it's the family dynamics, it plays a role. So those kids will look at East Germany and how East Germany shaped the family and the family saga and their own life differently than kids like me. For us, it was just a big freedom and we could do whatever we wanted to do. I wouldn't be a lawyer, I wouldn't be a diplomat, I never would have worked for a German president if that wouldn't have happened. And so, yeah, in particular in the 90s, the East German experience played a big role still in both directions. And then we have, in hard times, and that's very human, we have also a nostalgic in the society. That was already with Israel, with the people of Israel when they left Egypt and realized the life, the freedom is great, but it's still hardship, can be hardship. And that's in East Germany too. And there's a nostalgic, sometimes it diminished, of the good old time when life was much easier, everybody had a job. We were joking, everybody had a job, but nobody worked because there was no material, etc. But everybody had a social structure, and it was in some ways easier. There was oppression, and for people like me and who were active, it was terrible. But yes, you find the compromises, and this nostalgic sometimes is inherited, even by kids. And sometimes, and I always say, don't believe, even if the East Germany would have existed over the last 30 years, it would be a different East Germany. Why do you wish these times back? It would be different.
So I saw, oh, sorry, Hope, go ahead.
I would love to follow up on something that was said about what came before the wall and the fall of the wall and the demonstrations in Leipzig and Dresden and elsewhere. Many people who were part of sort of the opposition in East Germany in the fall of 1989 emphasize that the most important date is in fact not November 9th, it was October 9th in Leipzig. It was the month before in Leipzig when 70,000 people took to the streets, even though the regime had put out all sorts of sort of rumors that there was going to be a violent crackdown. They were gathering blood plasma and body bags in hospitals. And in spite of that, 70,000 individuals decided to go onto the streets in Leipzig and protest against the regime, holding candles and calling for reforms. So, in fact, tomorrow, on the 30th anniversary of that date in Leipzig, Chancellor Angela Merkel, President Steinmeier, and the whole leadership will be in Leipzig for formal ceremony commemorating the 30th anniversary of that turning point. And the way people put it succinctly in one sentence is, without October 9th in Leipzig, there wouldn't have been November 9th in Berlin with the fall of the wall.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention, and then we can change gears a bit after this. I saw a recent poll from this summer, which reported that 71% of West Germans felt German, while only 44% of Easterners replied the same, which is to say that Eastern Germans are feeling themselves to be more East German, right? Less German, right? So that, you know, again, this is just, you know, there are still, of course, differences across age and things like this and all these things we were talking about, right? But I think that's just an interesting statistic from August, that there still is some of these, you know, these differences in sort of thinking between thinking like a German and thinking of oneself as East German.
What is East German
Sure.
today? It is probably, yeah, it's the feeling not equal with the West
Yes.
Germans, right? I think, yeah, that's.
Yeah, well, I think it could be that, it could be, right, exactly, sort of the mark of that
It's
connection.
probably not that we think East Germany was the heaven,
Right,
but yeah.
well,
to be
feeling sort of different and, sort of,
Yeah.
second class in some ways
Yeah.
to West Germans, not feeling part of the whole. And I actually think that this sort of segues a bit to what I want to talk about next. This is one of these conversations where we could continue for hours on each topic, but I want to make sure we touch on a few other things and then, of course, give everyone a chance in the audience to ask some questions. So I think that, and Jonathan, I want to turn to you and talk a bit about sort of the electoral landscape in Germany today. And we know that, just to give everyone kind of a bit of the background, right, obviously we have Angela Merkel from the CDU running as chancellor of a unity government with the Social Democrats, Angela Merkel herself, an East German, so we have another example of that as well. But we also know that the party landscape in Germany is changing, and we're seeing increased support for the Alternative for Germany party, the AfD, and we're largely seeing support for that party in the former East. And so, Jonathan, I wonder if you could kind of talk a bit more about what the AfD is, what they stand for, why we're seeing so much support in the former East for this party currently.
Well, the AfD really came about 2013, 2014 during the last stages or in the wake of the Eurozone crisis. And at that time, it was pretty much an anti-EU or an EU skeptical party. It wouldn't be slotted as what we would call a right-wing populist party. But it underwent a transformation between 2014 and say 2015-16 to a classic right-wing populist party, and that is they didn't abandon their anti or their EU skeptical positions, but that receded into the background, and what became prominent was the anti-immigrant and populist aspects of the AfD, and that was, of course, seizing on the immigration, asylum, refugee debate in Germany at that time. And that's kind of the wave that the AfD has ridden. And it's, of course, it's been a phenomenon all over Germany. That is, it's represented in, I think, every state parliament now in Germany. And it did very well in the national elections. There may be an exception, I can't remember. But anyway, it's represented in many of the state parliaments, and it did very well in the last national election. But it has higher support in the East than it does in the West. It's got about 2 to 3 times the support in the East than it does in the West. And it's had spectacular figures in the last few state elections in Eastern Germany. So in the last 2 elections we just recently had in Brandenburg and Saxony, it got 23%, I think, in Brandenburg, 27% in Saxony. And it is made life extremely difficult for all the other parties in overall, but especially in Eastern Germany, because now they're finding difficulties putting together coalition governments that exclude the AfD, because everyone has said, well, we will not have a coalition with the AfD, making life very difficult to put together any reasonable, ideologically similar government in the state parliaments. I'll point out, because this is the area that I've worked in a lot, I've written a couple of books on the left party, the Linke, and it has particularly damaged the Linke. So the Linke have declined in the last 2 state elections. They went down almost, their vote was almost halved. And we know that there's massive transfer of votes from from people who used to vote for the left party who are now voting AfD. And this has meant that the left party, as well as all the other parties, of course, are scrambling to try to figure out how to deal with the AfD. So the AfD do not have power right now. They're not a part of any kind of government. They're always in the opposition. They'll remain so. But they have made it very difficult for all the other parties to govern effectively.
So why do you think there has been so much support in states like Saxony and other areas in the former East for the AFD? What is the appeal of this party?
Yeah, I mean, there's several explanations that have been looked at, but I think the one that it boils down to, and this goes for all over Germany, is that the single biggest predictor of voting AFD is anti-immigrant attitudes. So it is immigration above all. Now, we could talk about some other things that go along with that, or accompany that, or other issues. One of them I think that's particularly relevant in Eastern Germany is this feeling of disaffection with democracy and the political process, or the establishment parties, of which the Linke are now can be considered an establishment party because they've sat in state governments all over Eastern Germany. So that populist angle has been very important for the AFD in Eastern Germany. To talk about the established elites, we're going to go against the established elites. We're the true representatives of Eastern Germans and so forth. And particularly interesting to me in the last two state elections in Brandenburg and Saxony, the AFD ran a full-on Eastern nationalist, regionalist campaign. So they had posters that said, Vollende die Wende, complete the revolution. They said Wende 2.0. It was all about articulating this sense that they are the heirs of the 1989 revolution, which of course is abhorrent, but nevertheless, that's the kind of mantle they're claiming. And I think for a significant number of Eastern Germans, one other thing to keep in mind is Eastern Germany has always had a lot more voter volatility. That is, voters that switch from one party to the next, from one election to the next. So I remember a friend of a friend, I heard this from a friend, but it was her friend that said something like, East German, who said something like, well, we've tried all the other parties, why not try the AFD? And I think there is a sense for some Eastern German voters that the established parties have failed. So let's give the AFD a try. And besides, we don't like all these changes going on in our society, especially immigration.
Mm-hmm. So just a quick question, and then I think I would want to jump in on this. So if immigration, right, is such an important part of this, it begs the question that are we seeing more immigrants from outside of Germany in the East? In other words, are we seeing...
No, I mean, the answer is no.
Yes.
The answer is no, and it's really interesting when you look at the correlations between percentage of the vote the AFD gets and the percentage of foreigners, asylum seekers in that district. There's no correlation whatsoever. So it's not that the presence of the other makes people vote for AFD. It is the fear of the other, the fear of the immigrant, the fear of the asylum seeker that they see going on around them, not in their own hometown, but overall.
And I think this is actually a trend we're seeing in other places across Europe too. Do you want to jump in?
Not only in Europe.
Yes.
We see it all over the world. That's the refugees are all of the refugees that I don't do as good as I could.
Yes, thanks.
Yes, I mean, I can just underline it. I come from this region where the AFD has 30% of the votes, and you won't find a lot of refugees there. It's really more, I mean, it's protest, and it's still, we talked about this feeling, we are not equal with the West Germans, we are deprived of certain resources, and now there are millions of refugees coming in our country. In my village, the last supermarket will be closed down. The youth club doesn't work anymore, and nothing. And my politicians tell me there's no money for this, and then millions of refugees come, and we suddenly have billions of euros to feed them. It's a very easy story, and that's why and the AFD uses this. But there's one more point, at least from my perspective of why the AfD is so successful in East Germany. And this has also to do with the 40 years of communism, and don't forget there were a dictatorship before. So we talk about 60 years and more or less. That changed the social fabric in East Germany dramatically. In East Germany, the whole society, all associations, parties, clubs, etc., were in the end governed by the Communist Party, directly or indirectly, and controlled. There was no free association in the towns and villages. The church as a or religion as a very important aspect of social fabric was fought against, and the people left church by the millions. So in the end, 20% of the East Germans belonged to the church. In West Germany, this time 90%. So the self-organization of the society in the villages, in the towns, were basically abolished. And we had to start to create new social fabric, and that doesn't work as fast. And it was at the same time as the communication patterns of the society changed so dramatically towards individual communication pattern. So that's why we don't have established parties in East Germany like we have it in West Germany. Even in West Germany, they have a hard time, but they still exist. In East Germany, the Social Democrats, we have usually in these villages in Saxony, 2 people who are members of the Social Democratic Party. How can they run a campaign? How can they organize it? Unfortunately, the AfD somehow is successful in this field with their very simple messages.
No, maybe one sentence. So I totally agree. So I was always wondering why my neighbor, with whom I really got to well, he had his AfD flag flying one day, and I asked him, "What's wrong with you? You have Polish friends. Why are you not voting for AfD?" Yeah, and I mean, a couple of things go together, I think. And we see also that the AfD is especially strong in the border districts, not only in East Germany, but also in Bavaria. And this is also a question of European Union enlargement, the Schengen Agreement, and a general fear of the other. Yeah? Not necessarily they are not there, but you'll see that in Frankfurt there's a lot of Polish people on the streets, and they are actually clients of these German stores, right? But it disturbs this kind of orderly German kind of life for some people, I think. So my neighbor, he has a job, right? He has a job, his wife has a job, but still there's this discontent about irrational kind of fear. We just discussed it, yeah, so foreigners are, I mean, in history, usually are the scapegoats for everything that's going wrong. And we see it in Poland as well. We see it in Hungary, almost in all countries in Europe nowadays. So it's not that the East Germans are the only ones who tend to vote. I mean, and it's not the majority, right? Let's not forget that. Right? It's about hovering between 20 and maybe 30% in the extreme case. And it's also a lot of people that otherwise did not vote. It's, for some people, maybe the first time that they go to vote because they want to make a statement. That's my impression. Yeah, against the establishment. Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily, it has to do with xenophobia in every case, but it's an anti-establishment vote.
It's a protest vote, yeah, which we see in lots of places. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's why a lot of voters of the Linke, the former Communist Party, moved to the right, because now this is the protest.
Yeah.
Right.
It's right. It's really interesting.
Well, I want to give everyone, oh, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to add one factor, I think, about the strength of the AfD in the East. And when I joined the conversation, David Gill was talking about the lack of Holocaust education, I think, in East Germany. I don't know what the context was of that, because that's when
It was just It was just an example for how ideologized history education was.
Okay, because it's very relevant in this discussion also, I think, because for decades in West Germany, there was a confrontation with the Holocaust and racism and what it meant to, sort of prejudice. And there was intensive government civic education of West German citizens, basically about human rights and respecting others and never doing again, never creating that kind of marginalized group, never persecuting such a group again. There was a very intensive focus on that in West Germany that did not happen in East Germany, precisely because their narrative of the Holocaust was, well, of the Nazi regime, was that the communists were the main victims, not the Jews. So East Germans didn't receive that, sensitive training really about human rights. And I think that's also part of what's going on now. And then just one final comment on the basic point that here we are 30 years after the fall of the wall, and suddenly everybody's talking about these big divisions between East and West, and people in the East are complaining. I mean, I've been astonished by this. This has been going on for the past year, that after 29, 30 years, suddenly there is this renewed discussion that only really sort of happened in the 90s when people were first unemployed and were very upset and very angry. And it's just like, it's come back to a boil now, really. I mean, it's front page news all the time in Germany. And I don't quite know what to make of that, because so many things have improved in the East. The wage difference between East and West has narrowed, unemployment has been reduced. So many things that have gone right, and the government has invested, billions in the East. And yet there's this narrative that seems to go beyond these sort of hard facts to this feeling that's been mentioned of being second-class citizens. And that's harder to deal with than some of the concrete economic issues, I think.
Thank you. No, I think that puts everything, gives us some perspective. I want to give everyone, so we have a huge audience here in the room, and we have several groups joining us remotely, which I assume have lots of questions. So I want to give everyone a chance to ask some questions. So,
yeah, thank you very much for that interesting discussion. I would like to return to the beginning about the economic issues, which came up now a few times. And I want to suggest that thinking in terms of Mittelstand, sort of medium-sized, non-publicly traded companies versus big companies, publicly traded companies, might not cut to the core of this, this problem. Because if you look at a federal state like Baden-Württemberg, I just pulled it up, which is an economic powerhouse, the majority of the companies are actually Mittelstand, medium-sized, under 10,000 employees, non-publicly traded companies. So it's not Mercedes, the same for Bayern. But what I think would be interesting in conjunction with that question, and that might link up to the question of the AfD, because the AfD has also supported West Germany, is what Professor Olsen said. To which extent do we need to refine these measures by looking not so much at East and West, but rural versus urban areas in conjunction with generation as a sociological category, in order to figure out what's happening with this affective, situation that people still feel in the East they're second-class citizens. And here I would suggest what Professor Spoon said and what came out in your the last comment too. We might need to also bring communications to the table, people who really study how images are circulating, how affective narratives are circulating in the media, because I would agree that when you look at the hard data, you cannot really say the East is still, colonized or sort of abgehängt, yeah, left somewhere in the dust. But the question for me is, and that is, every anniversary allows people to pitch something about this anniversary. To which extent is the media really very important in understanding why, when we do these surveys, people respond in a way which is so contradictory to the hard data? But I was particularly interested in the rural urban thing you brought up, the rural urban split, Professor Olsen, whether that is the same in both with the AfD, but also perhaps with respect to economic issues in East Germany and with the former East Germany and West Germany.
Jonathan, do you want to respond?
Well, I don't know if there's a whole lot of support that this is a huge kind of split of the AfD, but I do know that it has done generally better in rural areas than urban areas. And the other thing that's interesting, and this would kind of take us full circle back to the very beginning things that we talked about, it's also something of a north-south divide. I don't want to play that up too much, but some of the evidence we've seen so far has been that the AfD is doing better in the southern parts of Germany, and that's both west and east, than in the northern parts of Germany, which is really interesting. I don't know what to attribute that to, or whether the next couple of state elections may but it is an interesting phenomenon here. One thing we can say, if we're looking at the rural kind of urban divide in terms of income, and I think several of the panelists have already talked about this before, is that it's not the AfD voter is not necessarily the economically disadvantaged voter, but rather a voter who fears that they are, or perceives that they're economically disadvantaged. And it's interesting, some polls have been done on AfD voters that they are much more likely to think that they will do poorly in the future. So their perspectives are very different than other kinds of voters. So it's the fears of the future, it's the perception that they're not doing as well now, and so forth, that I think plays something of a role for the AfD.
And the fears which are served particularly by the AfD. The AfD is...
Yeah, but the AfD wouldn't have that huge of a platform if the media would not always jump like it did with Trump,
It's the media. I don't want to do media bashing here, but of course, it's also what the media is serving, but it's also the way of communication. You can, who reads the newspaper today of the AfD voters? It's really this echo chambers of communication, which makes it so hard. And fake news, or however you want to name it, it's a big problem for the politicians in Saxony. Saxony has a very active prime minister, a governor. Mm-hmm. He was running around the country months before the election. Really, he was basically every village. However, the people who have their opinion, they don't care about this. These are open. They have no idea what's going on here at the grassroots. And that's really, really frustrating. Talk to the politicians in this region. They are frustrated. And they don't have the solution. How clear is this? But maybe the media can play a role. Maybe.
Let me have another question.
Okay, thank you very much for all the insights you share in this conversation. I will have 3 questions. I will try to be very brief. I think they are very different, but related to the general conversation. So the first one will be for David Gill. We were talking at the beginning about the population decline, unemployment, young people, and I wanted to know how, from the point of view of public policy, education and training was conceptualized in terms of themes and orientation to counteract this youth unemployment and this population decline in the East. The second question has a lot to do with the seeming paradox, the fact that we are celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall, And since then, we have been seeing walls and fences and barriers ever growing everywhere. So we can talk about that proliferation of walls after the end of after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I want to talk more about that, about this new paradox. And finally, I think we're always forgetting, and I say that from the point of view of a historian, another revolution. During the 90s, we had internet. We had this explosion of internet, this explosion of a new technological revolution. So how can we interconnect these different revolutions and the impact of these new technologies in politics and society in Germany, but also globally? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a lot of good questions. Would you like
Just very briefly, I mean, in the early 90s, there were just no jobs in East Germany because they were not competitive. And what it was not so much that they didn't have educated, let's say, plumbers, electricians. In the construction area, there were jobs, but in other areas. Even in East Germany, we had a pretty well developed vocational education. Dual education that was traditional in Germany, were really trained for your job in all sorts of jobs. And of course, there were new challenges with new technology, etc. There were big training programs by the labor administration, maybe not as effective as it could have been, and sometimes leading in the wrong direction. But in general, that was addressed. And a big part of the labor market was also public projects run by unemployment people. But education, yes, there's a big emphasis, particularly on vocational education.
Oh, maybe I answered the question about the borders.
Sure. Yes. I was going to say. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for the question. So coming from a border town myself, I mean Frankfurt Oder. So for me, when I started my college education, it was way after the fall of the wall, the mid-90s, but there was another wall there, right, on the Polish-German border, which at the time was the EU external border. Yeah, so I lived in a dormitory on the Polish side, and I had to show my papers every day to cross into college, right? And for us, young Europeans who went there because we wanted to live in an exciting place where Europe is happening, right, and is opening. So the big celebration was in 2004, and then again in 2007, when Poland, when the borders were really abolished, right, and border controls. So just to put this into context, so for some people, the fall of the wall didn't mean that the borders at all were gone, right? And then my wife is from East Poland, so in the 90s it was fairly easy to travel to Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and I mean, just as you said, so we have one border less, but then we have new borders constructed. So today it's with Ukraine it's of course better, but with Russia and Belarus it's not so easy to travel, right? So the new external Schengen border is now in the east, and that's the price now that the people over there pay for the borderless Europe. And so Eastern Europe is paying for this, I believe. So, yeah.
But even for Eastern Europe, it's easier to go to the West than it was before the wall came down.
That's true.
I mean, I was 23,
Sure.
I lived in Berlin, and I was never on the west side of the wall. The wall was probably 500 meters from my apartment. It's now an economical question, etc. But in general, you have a chance to go somewhere.
Yeah, of course, this has changed, right? But it depends on who you are. If you are, for example, someone who wants to get into Europe as a refugee, so 20 years ago, people were drowning on the Oder River, just 80 kilometers east of Berlin, right? Which is kind of ironic, right? In a very dark sense. Yeah. Today, people are drowning in the Mediterranean, as we know, but they're also drowning in the Bug River farther east. Yeah. So it's quite ambitious. So we are so happy about the falling borders, but I mean we see it in other places in the world. We have new borders. So there's maybe a difference. The border between the two Germanies was erected to keep people in, right? So that's really a major difference. The other borders are built to keep people out, mostly.
So I think since we Okay, I think I'm getting the time. I was gonna say one more question, so I think we can end. Thank you to all of my guests and to the audience as well. This was a great conversation. I know there were so many things that you all probably wanted to ask, but hopefully this gave some insight into the various cultural, political, social questions that we're still grappling with in Germany today. So thank you to everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.